In the spring of 1922, a small mail carrier in rural Bavaria noticed something wrong. Not wrong in the way that a broken fence is wrong, or a missed delivery. Wrong in the way that only deep instinct can recognize. The kind of wrongness that settles into your chest before your mind has caught up. The Gruber family hadn't been seen in days. Their mail sat uncollected. Their livestock were thin and frightened, but still alive. Someone had been feeding them. Someone had been inside that house. And yet, no one had come or gone. What investigators found when they finally opened that door would haunt German criminal history for over a century. 6 people, brutally murdered. Their killer, never caught. To understand what happened at Hinterkaifeck, you have to understand the place itself. The farm sat roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich, in the Weidhofen municipality of Bavaria. Hinterkaifeck wasn't even a proper town. It was a name for a single isolated farmstead, surrounded by forest and field, cut off from the nearest village by a stretch of empty road that few bothered to travel. In 1922, rural Bavaria was a world still largely untouched by the 20th century. The First World War had ended just 4 years prior, leaving behind economic ruin and a traumatized population. Farms like Hinterkaifeck ran on isolation, self-sufficiency, and strict family hierarchy. The Grubers were, by most accounts, a prosperous farming family. But deeply unusual. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old. He was known as domineering, secretive, and difficult. His wife, Cecilia, was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35 years old, lived on the farm with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. And then there was the maid. Maria Baumgartner had only just arrived at the farm that very afternoon. The same afternoon, the family was killed. She had barely unpacked her bags. 6 people, 1 farm, 1 very bad night. But the story of Hinterkaifeck doesn't begin on the night of the murders. It begins years before, with a scandal that would have destroyed most families, and a warning that Andreas Gruber dismissed with chilling indifference. Andreas Gruber had been prosecuted and convicted for incest with his daughter Victoria. Court records from 1914 show he served time in prison for the offence. When he returned to the farm, nothing changed. Many believed the 2-year-old Joseph was not Victoria's husband's child, but Andreas's own. Victoria's husband had died on the Western Front during the war, a convenient absence. There were also whispers about Victoria's previous maid, Crescens Rieger. She had left the farm in 1921, abruptly and without giving clear reasons. When later interviewed, she described an atmosphere of fear and secrecy, strange sounds, unexplained lights in the barn at night. She'd left, she said, because she felt like something terrible was waiting to happen. She was right. In the weeks before the murders, Andreas Gruber told his neighbors something that should have sent a chill through anyone who heard it. He'd found footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest toward the farmhouse, but no prints leading back. He'd also found an unfamiliar newspaper on the farm, and he'd heard footsteps in the attic. Someone, Andreas believed, had been living in the attic of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, sleeping there, eating there, watching the family below. He reported none of this to police. He just went back inside. Forensic reconstruction suggests the murders took place on the evening of March 31st, 1922, a Friday. The 3 adults and young Cecilia were lured or led into the barn, one by one. The method of killing was blunt force trauma, a mattock, investigators later concluded. A farm tool, heavy, practical, brutal. The young girl's fingernails were torn down to the quick. She had been alive after the others were killed, in the dark, in the barn, pulling at her own hair, possibly for hours. She was the last to die. Inside the house, Victoria's infant son, Josef, was killed in his crib. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was killed in her room. What happened next is the detail that investigators would fixate on for decades. The killer, or killers, did not flee. They stayed. Evidence suggests someone lived in the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse for several days after the murders. The livestock were fed. Food was eaten. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney. Someone lit a fire, cooked meals, slept in the beds, with 6 bodies in the barn. It wasn't until April 4th, 4 days after the murders, that anyone grew concerned. Young Kazilia had failed to appear at school. Andreas had missed a planned meeting. The mail carrier noticed the overflowing letterbox. A group of neighbors went to investigate. What they found in the barn defied description. The bodies had been neatly covered with hay. The farm was, in most ways, perfectly ordinary. Tools hung in their places. Animals stood quietly in their stalls. Police from Munich were called. When investigators arrived and began processing the scene, they found something that deepened the mystery considerably. Multiple people had eaten at the farmhouse after the murders. A neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who would later become a key suspect, was among the first on the scene and handled the bodies before police arrived. He told investigators he'd been trying to identify them. What he'd actually done, forensically speaking, was contaminate the most important crime scene in Bavarian history. The story broke across Bavaria and then across Germany. Front-page headlines, public hysteria. A reward was posted. Tips flooded in. None of them led anywhere. Over the following decades, and then century, the Hinterkaifeck case would attract more investigators, amateur sleuths, academic criminologists, and documentarians than almost any other unsolved murder in German history. The suspect list was long. Investigators narrowed it to several key figures. Suspect 1, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was a neighbor who had, in the past, been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel. Many believed Josef, the murdered infant, was his biological son. He had reason to visit the farm. He knew the layout. He arrived at the scene early and handled the evidence. His behavior on the discovery day was erratic and later described by police as suspicious. He gave multiple, conflicting statements over the years. He was questioned multiple times. He was never charged. He died in 1941, with the case still open. Suspect 2, an unknown drifter. Some investigators theorized the killer was a transient. From the post-war chaos that plagued the German countryside in the early 1920s, the footprints leading from the forest, the unfamiliar newspaper, the attic presence, this theory would explain the randomness of the crime, but not the intimacy of it. The killer knew the farm, knew the routines, stayed for days without panic. Drifters don't stay, they run. Suspect 3, a family secret. The most unsettling theory, and perhaps the most credible, is that the murders were carried out by someone known to the family. Someone with deep personal grievance. Someone who felt both entitled and wronged. The extended patience, the days spent living in the house afterward, suggests not a crime of rage, but of cold, deliberate conclusion. Like someone who had waited a very long time and was in no hurry to leave. In 2007, students at the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck were assigned the Hinterkaifeck case as a training exercise. They reviewed over 4,000 pages of investigative files, documents gathered across almost a century of inquiry. Their conclusion: Lorenz Schlittenbauer remain the most probable suspect, but most probable is not a conviction, and Schlittenbauer had been dead for 66 years. The case was officially still open. It still is today. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was demolished in 1923, just 1 year after the murders. The official reason given was hygiene concerns. The more likely reason, no one wanted it standing. A small shrine was eventually erected on the site. The land passed through several owners. The farm was never rebuilt. The skulls of the 6 victims were removed during the original investigation for forensic examination and were not returned with the rest of the remains. They were misplaced. They weren't found until 1999 in a Munich forensics storage facility. 77 years later, the skulls of the Hinterkaifeck victims were finally given a proper burial. Cases like Hinterkaifeck endure not only because they're unsolved, but because of what they reveal about the margins of human civilization, the rural isolation, the family secrets tolerated by a community that looked away, the failure of institutions, a man reporting signs of a stalker and being dismissed, or dismissing himself, a crime scene contaminated before police arrived, evidence scattered, lost, mishandled across a century. There is something else too, something harder to name. The Hinterkaifeck murders produce a particular kind of dread that even the most hardened true crime audience tends to notice. It isn't the violence itself, though that is horrific enough. It's the image of someone staying, lighting a fire, feeding the animals, eating from the pantry, moving through a house full of death as though they owned the place, as though they had finally come home. We don't know who did this. We may never know. But a century later, in farmhouses, in isolated places, in the quiet before sleep, the question still finds us. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most investigated and least resolved criminal cases. The original investigative files run to over 4,000 pages. More than 100 suspects were interviewed over the decades. No one was ever charged. If you found this case as compelling as I do, and if you think you have a theory, let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep looking into the dark places. The answers are usually there. We just have to be willing to find them.